They say the mountains speak, though not in words you can hear, and not in ways any human has truly understood. It begins with those who enter their shadows, drawn by curiosity, necessity, or a yearning for something that lies beyond the ordinary world. Among these mountains, a group of travelers once ventured where no paths were marked, guided only by scraps of old maps and tales whispered by villagers who had glimpsed the peaks from afar. At first, their journey seemed simple: rocky trails, cold winds, the kind of hardship any mountaineer would expect. Yet as they pressed higher, small oddities began to appear. A stone that seemed to shift underfoot, a shadow that stretched impossibly long, fog curling upward in coils instead of sinking into the valleys. On the second day, they discovered carvings etched into a cliff face, spirals, open hands, eyes, patterns repeated with precise symmetry. No one admitted to making them, and their presence caused an uneasy silence among the group. That night, as they camped in a narrow crevice, strange lights appeared on the ridges above. They hovered, moving like living creatures, casting an ethereal glow that reflected in their eyes. And then they heard it, a faint whispering, not carried by the wind, yet unmistakable. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Each traveler swore it spoke directly to them, echoing thoughts they had never voiced, secrets they had never shared. Sleep brought no relief. Dreams were vivid, almost waking visions of forests of stone, crystalline lakes, and valleys that twisted into themselves endlessly. One traveler awoke to find frost patterned with symbols around the tent, spirals and hands that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. None had made them. In the days that followed, the mountains seemed alive. Paths shifted subtly, forcing the travelers to retrace steps, yet always leaving a sense that they had passed the same point before. The air carried a hum, vibrating in rhythm with their thoughts, stirring memories and fears they had long buried. Rivers sometimes ran backward, and streams reflected skies that were not above. Compasses spun wildly, pointing not north, but into ravines, as if urging them to look deeper. Bridges appeared where none should exist, made of twisted roots or stone that seemed to pulse, forming steps across gaps that would have been otherwise impossible to cross. And still, the travelers pressed on, drawn by a force they could not name. They glimpsed figures on distant cliffs, moving silently, watching without recognition. The carvings in hidden caves grew more intricate, suggesting maps, directions, or perhaps messages, but no mind could fully comprehend them. Time became unreliable. Days could stretch into weeks or pass in moments. Some nights they felt the mountains breathing around them, a slow, steady presence that watched, judged, and remembered. Conversations became difficult. Words felt inadequate to describe the experiences, and often they found themselves speaking in fragments, gesturing at visions only they could see. They began to realize that the mountains tested those who entered, revealing wonders only to those who approached with humility, attention, and reverence. Arrogance or fear brought confusion, leading travelers back upon themselves, lost in loops of fog and stone. And yet, despite the growing unease, there were moments of awe. Hidden grottos where waters glowed like liquid crystal, forests of luminous moss that hummed underfoot, caves filled with crystals that captured and refracted light in impossible ways. Even these miracles carried a warning. The mountains gave, but exacted a toll. Memory of the ordinary world began to fade for some, replaced by images and sensations that belonged only to the peaks. A sense of being watched, ever-present and quiet, settled in their minds. By the end of the first week, the group had changed. Their pace was slower, their eyes alert to details the outside world would ignore. They spoke less, for speech seemed inadequate, and slept lightly, listening to whispers in the wind, voices that might be imagination or something else entirely. One morning, a traveler disappeared. There was no sign, no scream, only a faint shimmer in the fog where he had last stood. The others searched, shouting, calling, but found only the echoes of their own voices returning in strange distortions, as if the mountains themselves repeated their fears back to them. When they pressed on, the carvings appeared again, guiding them, or perhaps deceiving them, toward a narrow pass that ended in a hidden valley. There, the air was different, thick with a quiet vibration, a hum that resonated with their very bones. The valley glimmered with colors no human eyes had names for. Streams ran with a clarity that revealed visions of other places, other times, and the fog moved as though alive, curling around cliffs and rocks like fingers tracing a secret. The travelers felt awe, fear, and disbelief, all mingled together, a dizzying awareness that they had crossed into something entirely unlike the world they knew. And yet, even within this beauty, there was unease, a sense that the mountains remembered them, that they were part of the landscape now, observed, recorded, folded into the story of the peaks themselves. Those who lingered too long reported strange dreams, entire lifetimes passing in moments, landscapes folding into themselves, and figures moving without sound or feet, watching silently. When they finally left the hidden valley, if leaving is even the right word, they discovered the world beyond had changed as well. Their memory of time, of direction, of distance was uncertain. Some could not recall how many days had passed. Others could not remember familiar towns, roads, or rivers. And still, in quiet moments, they felt the pull again, a tug at the edge of perception, urging them to return, to follow the hidden paths deeper into the mountain's heart. The legend of these peaks persisted long after their return, whispered by those few who survived the journey intact. They spoke of mountains alive with memory, aware of every footstep, every thought, and every fear. They told of wonders beyond imagination, crystalline grottos, luminous fog, forests of stone, rivers that ran backward, and of trials that could unravel the mind, bending perception, time, and memory itself. And though many dismissed the tales as madness, some travelers, drawn by curiosity, adventure, or the promise of hidden knowledge, could not resist. The mountains called, always, silently, patiently, and eternally. The next morning, the travelers awoke to a silence so profound it felt like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The fog had thickened overnight, rolling in from hidden valleys and wrapping around cliffs, softening edges, and masking the paths they had followed the day before. Even the wind was still, as if some invisible hand had paused the world itself. As they began to move, they realized that the ordinary rules no longer applied. A trail that had taken them an hour to cross the day before now seemed endless, twisting and doubling back in ways their minds could not reconcile. Rocks shifted subtly underfoot, forming steps that appeared and disappeared, guiding them, or perhaps testing them. One of the travelers noticed a reflection in a pool of water that did not match her movements. Her arm rose, but the figure in the reflection remained still, staring. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and the image vanished, leaving only the glint of stones in the sun. The air was thick with a hum, low and resonant, that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the mountains themselves. It pressed against their chests, stirring unease and awe in equal measure. The travelers moved cautiously, aware that every glance might reveal something impossible, that every sound might carry a message or a warning. In a narrow canyon, they encountered carvings etched into stone, spirals, and eyes intertwined with hands reaching upward. These symbols repeated across cliffs, caves, and ledges, sometimes appearing in frost overnight or in dust along trails. No human hand could have made them so precisely, and yet they seemed intentional, almost guiding, almost sentient. As they followed the subtle cues, the fog began to take shapes, forming vague outlines of figures, animals, and structures that vanished when approached too closely. One traveler reached toward a shape that resembled a tree, and the form dissolved into mist, leaving only dew glinting on stone. Nights were the most disorienting. Campfires flickered, but shadows moved in ways that made no sense. One would stretch across a cliff and then curl upward, vanishing entirely, while another would appear behind the traveler, who was facing the opposite direction. Sounds carried differently, too. Footsteps echoed from places too far to be real. Whispers returned answers to questions they had not spoken aloud. Dreams were vivid, almost waking visions of landscapes that twisted impossibly, rivers looping back upon themselves, mountains stacked in impossible geometries. One night, the youngest traveler awoke to find frost patterned with spirals and symbols around her sleeping mat. She had not drawn them, and yet they shimmered faintly in the moonlight, suggesting meaning, direction, or perhaps a warning. The group pressed onward, compelled by a force they could not name. They began to notice subtle signs that seemed to indicate the mountain's awareness. A branch would shift to form a step, a rock would move slightly to reveal a hidden crevice. A pool of water reflected not the sky above, but a version of the valley that lay elsewhere entirely. Time became unreliable. Days and nights blended, moments stretching into hours, hours collapsing into seconds. Food and water felt sufficient, but fatigue settled into their bones more deeply than any exertion should warrant. One morning, a traveler reported that his own reflection no longer resembled him. Eyes wider than before, features sharpened, a faint glow in the skin under sunlight. The others saw it too, though they could not reconcile it with the person they knew. In a hidden grove, they discovered trees with bark that pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Moss glowed softly in colors that had no name, and the streams ran with water, so clear it reflected visions not present in the surrounding world. Visions of cities of crystal, of beings moving silently without legs or wings, observing the mountain's surface as if cataloging every detail. The travelers felt awe and fear entwined. Even as the mountains revealed wonders, they insisted upon vigilance, humility, and respect. Those who hurried or looked away were soon confused, finding themselves back at places they had already crossed, retracing steps with no memory of doing so. One evening, the fog parted to reveal a narrow pass leading to a hidden valley. The air within the pass was different, thick with a subtle vibration that resonated with their very bones, and colors that seemed impossible to perceive in ordinary light shimmered along the rocks. As they stepped into the valley, the mountains seemed to hold their breath again, and a strange, almost imperceptible warmth brushed against their skin. They could see the peaks above bending in ways that defied geometry, cliffs folding, rivers spiraling upward, and stones stacked impossibly, forming bridges across gaps that should have been uncrossable. Here, the mountains were no longer just a landscape. They were a consciousness, aware of their presence, recording every thought and movement. The valley offered both beauty and peril. Crystal clear lakes reflected visions of other places, forests of stone hummed softly, and fog curled around cliffs like protective fingers, concealing paths and revealing others. The travelers understood, instinctively, that the mountains had not trapped them, nor led them blindly. They had been tested. Those who moved with respect, with awareness, with humility, were allowed glimpses of wonders beyond imagination. Those who rushed, who doubted, who feared, would soon find themselves lost in loops of path and fog, retracing steps endlessly until the mind itself questioned reality. And so, the travelers learned slowly, painfully, that the mountains were not just stone and ice, wind and mist. They were guardians, keepers of memory, observers of humanity. Each moment spent within their folds was a lesson, each vision a fragment of truth, and each whisper a guide or a warning. Some nights, when they slept lightly in the luminous groves, they could hear faint voices echoing in harmony with the mountain's hum, telling stories of those who had come before, lives folded into the peaks, waiting for the next traveler to understand or be understood. The travelers stayed in the hidden valley longer than they had intended, drawn by its beauty and the strange pull they could not name. Days blurred into nights, and nights into something neither fully awake nor fully dreaming. Streams glimmered with colors that defied explanation, flowing over stones etched with spirals, eyes, and hands reaching skyward. Every step revealed something new. Trees that bent without breaking, forming arches over narrow paths. Rocks that seemed to hum under their touch, resonating with a frequency that made their chests thrum, and fog that swirled around cliffs, forming shapes so detailed it felt as though memories had taken corporeal form. One evening, as the sun dipped behind jagged peaks, the fog shifted to reveal what looked like a city carved entirely from crystal. Towers rose impossibly high, catching the last rays of sunlight and refracting them into cascades of color that danced across the valley floor. Figures moved among the towers, translucent yet defined, walking without sound, observing without eyes. The travelers could not tell if the visions were real or a creation of the mountains, but the pull to explore remained irresistible. They followed winding paths that seemed to respond to their intentions. Each turn revealed new wonders, but also new tests. Bridges over chasms appeared only when approached with care and vanished if crossed recklessly. Patterns in the frost, the stone, and the mist seemed to shift subtly, guiding those who paid attention and misleading those who ignored them. Time became increasingly unreliable. A single night in the valley could stretch to weeks in perception, and hours could vanish like smoke. Some travelers began to dream while awake, seeing glimpses of events that had not yet occurred, memories that were not their own, and landscapes that existed only in impossible geometry. One night, as they camped beside a crystalline stream, the youngest traveler touched the water and saw her reflection shift into a version of herself she did not recognize. Eyes wider, features sharpened, a subtle glow to her skin, and a knowing expression that did not belong to her. The others witnessed it, and silence fell. They realized that the mountains were not passive observers. They were altering perception, bending reality, and perhaps even shaping the travelers themselves. The valley seemed alive with awareness. Birds flew backward through the sky, their wings slicing through space with uncanny precision. Streams ran uphill, defying gravity. Rocks formed steps where none should exist. And always, there was a hum, a vibration felt in bones and mind alike, a rhythm that seemed to record, assess, and respond. Despite the wonders, unease grew. The travelers began to notice subtle signs of the mountain's scrutiny, shadows that moved independently, whispering winds that seemed to answer unspoken questions, and trails that twisted and doubled back as if testing their focus and humility. One morning, they awoke to find frost patterns etched around their camp in elaborate spirals and geometric designs that glimmered faintly in the sunlight. No one had made them. The symbols seemed to offer guidance, though their meaning was elusive, and following them became both imperative and terrifying. The travelers understood instinctively that to ignore the signs was to risk being lost, or worse, to become part of the mountain's memory, folded into stone and mist, observed eternally. Yet the allure was irresistible. They felt that the mountains held knowledge not meant for ordinary life. Glimpses of hidden histories, visions of civilizations that never existed in any known record, and the faintest sense of truths beyond human comprehension. They pressed further into the valley, guided by intuition and the subtle cues etched in stone, frost, and fog. Paths appeared only when approached with reverence, revealing grottos filled with water that reflected not the world above, but alternative landscapes. Valleys folded into themselves, cities of crystal, forests of impossible forms. Beings moved silently within these reflections, observers and guardians of the peak's mysteries. Days of travel became exercises in patience, attention, and awareness. The mountains rewarded those who watched and listened, and punished those who rushed or doubted. One traveler, ignoring a faint pattern etched into frost, found herself retracing her steps endlessly, emerging hours later in the same spot, unable to remember how she had arrived. The valley seemed to breathe with life, expanding and contracting subtly, guiding or misleading depending on the traveler's intent and focus. And always, the awareness persisted. The mountains remembered, recorded, and observed every motion, every thought, every emotion. The travelers began to realize that leaving the valley would not be a simple matter. The peaks did not merely guard their secrets. They entwined themselves with those who entered, altering perception, memory, and understanding. To exit required not only physical movement, but alignment with the mountain's rhythm, an attunement to their subtle signals and hum. Some nights, the travelers would see distant lights moving along the peaks, pulsing in patterns that resembled stars but shifted impossibly, dancing in a language they could not decipher. They were beckoned, but to follow blindly could mean losing oneself entirely. And yet, the valley offered moments of unearthly beauty. Crystalline lakes reflecting skies unseen elsewhere, forests of luminous stone humming softly, streams that glimmered with visions of other places and other times. Every sensation was amplified, every perception heightened, until ordinary reality felt distant and fragile. By the end of their first week within the hidden valley, the travelers understood something profound. The mountains were not merely a place, but a consciousness. A sentinel of stone, fog, light, and memory, patient and eternal. Those who entered were observed, tested, and changed. The valley was a teacher, a guide, a mirror, and a keeper of secrets far older than humanity. The travelers knew, deep in their bones, that the valley held its ultimate secret, one final revelation reserved for those who endured its tests and attuned themselves fully to its rhythm. By now, they had learned to move with care, to watch shadows, to read patterns in stone, frost, and fog, and to listen to the hum that pulsed through the mountains like a heartbeat older than time itself. On the final morning, the mist parted to reveal a passage so narrow and steep it seemed impossible to traverse, yet somehow, instinct guided them. As they climbed, the air thickened with a subtle vibration that resonated with their very minds, and the colors around them shimmered in hues no eye could name, blending stone, light, and sky into a single, living mosaic. At the peak, they found a plateau bathed in an otherworldly glow, and at its center, a still pool of water, perfectly clear, reflecting not their images but visions, entire lifetimes, choices they had never made, paths they could never have imagined. And there, standing as if waiting for them, were figures of light, neither human nor creature, moving without sound, observing with patient curiosity. The travelers realized in that instant that they were witnessing the essence of the mountains themselves, a consciousness shaped over millennia, recording, remembering, and revealing its truths to those who could see without fear, who could walk with humility and attention. One by one, they knelt by the pool, touching the water and feeling a connection unlike anything before. Memories of the ordinary world softened and blended with visions from the peaks, and they understood that the mountains held more than stone and air. They held knowledge, experience, and the echoes of every soul who had dared enter. When they finally descended, the valley behind them shimmered briefly and then vanished into fog, leaving no trace of the path they had taken. They returned to the world beyond the mountains, but they were forever changed. Their perception of time, of space, of reality itself was altered. They spoke little of what they had seen, for words could not contain the truth. Yet in quiet moments, when the wind carries a familiar hum and shadows curl in impossible ways, they feel the pull again, the gentle tug of the mountain's consciousness, patient, eternal, and ever watching. The legend lives on, whispered among villagers and travelers alike, that somewhere, beyond maps and trails, a range of living peaks waits, holding secrets older than humanity, offering wonders beyond imagination, and granting glimpses of the impossible to those willing to surrender themselves to its eternal, silent call. Those who listen carefully can still hear the hum, feel the presence, and wonder if the mountains remember them, even as they walk in the ordinary world, forever marked by the peaks that test, teach, and endure.